Hello, everyone. I'm Jamie Flinchball here, and we're doing our interviews on strategy, strategic thinker, strategic planning. Have with us today a good friend of mine, Jeff Grimshaw, who's one of the co-founders of MG Strategy. Worked together before, hung out, talk shop, and so today we're going to talk shop on strategy. So Jeff, hello, and why don't you tell us a little more about yourself?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Jamie, I'm happy to talk to you about any topic, anytime, but I was excited when you asked me to talk about strategy. That's one of the, I talk about anything, regardless of whether I have an informed point of view, but I'd like to think this is one of those handful of topics that I might actually have an informed point of view on. So yeah, thank you for the introduction of MG Strategy, where I'm one of the principals and also the author of two books. First one is Leadership Without Excuses: How to Create Accountability and High Performance Instead of Just Talking About It. I like to make sure there's at least 40 syllables in each of these book titles. and the one that came out just this last year is 5 Frequencies: Leadership Signals that Turn Culture into Competitive Advantage.
Fantastic and great books. I've been fans of both, and yeah, with strategy, I mean, we haven't done this much, but I did at least once get to engage with you on a client on some strategy building, and so I know that you do a range of different things, but helping leaders with their strategy is a part of it. So when that conversation starts, I mean, how do you define strategy? It's an easy word to throw around. What does strategy look like to you?
The way I think about strategy is that it is managing activities and trade-offs in an effort to maximize ROI with a time horizon that is longer than 15 minutes from now. So in other words, we've got activities and life's full of trade-offs. So it's about making those decisions in a way where we want to get maximum value from that. And we're thinking whether it's, again, further than 15 minutes out, it could be 15 days from now, it could be 15 months from now, it could be 15 years from now. But that longer time horizon, I think, is a key element. It's not just goal directed, it's goal directed with a longer time horizon than what's immediately in front of us, I think is key.
That's really important perspective, right? So the time horizon is a big factor in whether it's strategy or just tactics. As you said, time horizon might be longer than 15 minutes, but it might be weeks, it might be years. Is the difference between weeks and years based on how fast an organization's market is moving, or how fast they're moving, or where they are in the organization? What determines what that time horizon should look like?
Yeah, I think that we are increasingly in an environment where we are where when we say years, we might be fooling ourselves a lot of time. If we're thinking about it on an organizational scale, weeks is sometimes too short. But I think I also just think, in my experience, with working with leaders, is that things have to. 18 months feels even 18 months or more feels theoretical to people, and I think it's easier for people to make choices, to make tough trade-off decisions when the consequences feel closer. So I guess that's a long way of saying I'm seeing increasingly that while it's important to push the time horizon out longer than 15 minutes, I'm also seeing on the other side the time horizon coming closer in terms of, it's not 5 years, and it's getting 18 months and then getting pulled closer back.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I've seen that same sort of shift happening, where the order of magnitude of changes might not be bigger than it was 40 years ago, but it is faster, and that affects it. Now, I do think that having a perspective that's multi-year, having a point of view, having a vision might have a time horizon, but as you said, making trade-off decisions, that's tougher to do unless they're very material in terms of making trade-offs.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that's also really important to me, and I think important to leaders, is that when you're talking about strategy, that and you're thinking about trade-offs, that it's not just about business planning, it's about just about everything. One of the things I was thinking about, because I saw somebody was mentioning this client, and I was thinking about him the other day. There's a guy, and this was about 15 years ago actually, where he was a direct report to Joe Naccio, who was the CEO at Quest, who later went to prison. But back when this was happening, this was a guy who was a member of Joe Naccio's team, and Joe had said to him, "Hey, you do these few things, and I'm going to back your play." And so this guy that I was working for did these few things, and instead of Joe backing his play, he just humiliated him in front of the rest of the executive team. And so I was out in Denver, and he said, "Jeff, I need your help on what I'm going to do here. Which of these ways should I go in and tell Joe that was completely unacceptable, and tell him basically to F off?" I mean, it was just variations on a theme.
Right.
And I said, "I want to help you be strategic here. There's a frame of reference in communication that says there are three goals in all human communication. There's task, identity, and relationships." And I said to this leader, "Okay, what are your identity goals here?" And he said, "How do you want to be seen?" And he said, "I want to be seen as somebody who you can't do that to, where you can't mess with them the way that I was messed with here." And I said, "Great. What are your relationship goals?" And he said, "Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be, I'm not going to be stepped on that way. He needs to know that that's not acceptable." And I said, "Great. What are your task goals?" And he said, "Well," and I said, "No, really think about this. Like, what do you want to be true? What do you want to be true? Not 15 minutes from now, but like 15 days, 15 months, 15 years from now." And he said, "Honestly, what I'd really like to do is take a package and get out of here. I've been here for 18 months. I'm ready to be done." So I said, "Okay, well, listen, then let's be strategic, because that's about managing your choices and your trade-offs with a longer time horizon than what is going to have you feeling satisfied 15 minutes from now. So do you want to go in and like express yourself and try to get an apology, or do you want to just artfully frame this in a way where you get where he pays you, millions of dollars to walk off into the sunset?" So the strategic choice, I should have worked on commission that day, because taking a few percentage points of that would have paid off. But that's why I think it's important to say that the reason I like that definition of strategy is because it applies to not just business planning, but all the choices that we make as human beings who happen to spend time in organizations and in business. And so he made the strategic choice that I'm sure he is still very happy about. 15 years later, he went in and he got the package and used that as an exit opportunity. He never got an apology from Joe Naccio, which would have been meaningless anyway.
Right.
But that was about being. But he thought about his ROI and his trade-offs.
Now, that's a good example, because it really does demonstrate that even when the situation was unplanned or has nothing to do about the organization, but it's about the individual, strategy still has a fundamental role. And so it's how you approach something rather than what it is. So let me just building on that and maybe pulling that apart a little further. It kind of leads to this is, again, the definition of a strategy, but is it a process? Is it a decision? right? Or is it just a way of thinking? And that example really demonstrated a little bit of all three.
Yeah.
But how do you look at those three different dimensions?
Yeah, I'm going to start with a way of thinking. I agree that there's elements of all three of those apply, but to me, I think it has to be rooted in a way of thinking. I'm a big fan of Daniel Kahneman, who was, the psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2002. First person ever won the Nobel Prize in economics who never took an economics course, but what his claim to fame was actually bringing uh, uh, behavioral psychology into play to actually help economists do a better job of explaining how people make trade-off decisions. And he he wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and the idea was that humans we have two systems, and system one is our intuition, and it's automatic, it's effortless, it's fast, and it produces impressions. And system two is really about reason. So it's slower, it's more deliberate. It can be rules governed, but it's about consuming the brain power to produce decisions, judgments, and decisions, right? And so, just going back to the question about so where does strategy come from? It's really about being deliberate about when you're going to be deliberate, because if all you're doing is operating from system one all of the time, then you're probably not being strategic when you need to be strategic. As human beings, though, we are not capable of operating from system two all the time. We have to run on autopilot for many of the functions that we do, but a lot of self-awareness is required so that you can be so that you at least have triggers where you have to stop and choose to be strategic about something. But I said that one of the things that Kahneman said about our reason or our system two thinking is that it can be rule governed. And what that means is you can have good heuristics or rules of thumb that you use to help you make strategic choices so that you can do them as fast as possible. The reason that we rely mostly on system one and intuition is because we don't have time. But if you have a good set of heuristics, if you have a good set of rules of thumb that you don't use automatically, but at least help you make choices, then that helps you be more strategic. So, for example, when that example I was using earlier, the heuristic is to pause and to say, what am I trying to do in terms of task? What am I trying to do in terms of relationship? What am I trying to do in terms of identity? Or Jamie, that when we are helping clients think about culture, we say in the culture that gives you a source of competitive advantage, what do you need people to know and to feel and to do and to get really prioritized about that? So whether it's about heuristics or decision rules, or whether it's just about frameworks, there are some things that you can do to fast track. So it's a process rooted in thinking. There's some things that you can do to fast track your ability to efficiently actually apply strategic thinking to situations where otherwise you might just be left to run on effortless intuition, which might turn out great and might turn out terrible because it was not actually based on strategy.
Right. No, it's a favorite book of mine. I love that particular book, and what both of us do for a living is often help pull people into system two and improve their system one as an outcome or deliverable.
Right.
So we both spend a lot of time thinking about that as a process, and that ultimately becomes a strategic choice.
Right.
And certainly, as it's demonstrated, some people are better built for changing from system one to system two. Some people are just smarter about when they do it, but carrying that forward, that implies that there's a core capability there, right? And so, almost every organization today has a defined set of core capabilities that they want all their employees to have or all their managers to have. Some of them are often very generic, which is always frustrating to me, but it's not uncommon that strategic thinking ends up on the list, even though it may be ill-defined. But this really begs the question, especially framed around the system one, system two, being deliberate part is this, and I think I might know your answer, but I'd love to hear the reasons why. Is this a capability that everyone should have, or is it really just for the critical few making the most important decisions?
Yeah, I think it's important for everybody I think we'd all be well served if everybody upgraded their strategic thinking a notch or two.
Yeah. Well, and you demonstrated with that example, it's even about the choice of do I work in this company to stay and change my position, or do I work to position to get myself out? Well, name a person who doesn't make a choice like that at some point, and that's a strategic decision. So that's a great example that illustrates the idea that it's a human capability, not just an executive capability.
Yeah, and I in terms of like the stuff I get geeked out on, I love behavioral economics, and I love economists like Tim Harford who are applying, economics is all about value and trade-offs, and I love those guys who are applying the science to and those ways of thinking to everyday decision making, because I think I think that self-awareness is really key. I mean, I think that actually is so much of what strategic thinking is about. I think a lot of organizations, when they say they want people to be strategic thinkers, don't really know what they're talking about. They talk about it in very generic ways. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that to me, what's really important in terms of developing those capabilities is understanding human biases, having a user's manual for your brain, understanding what kinds of things that your brain is probably wired to do that are going to influence your trade-off decisions, your development of strategy. So, planning fallacy, for example, is one of the things where we tend to have rosy scenarios for how things are going to go, and we build that into our thinking and end up with bad strategy as a result. Sunk cost fallacy, where we where we irrationally continue to throw energy, invest in something to avoid the appearance of waste. Where you those are things that if you're aware of them and aware of your brain's propensity to tell you that something is actually rational and value creating when it isn't, that to me is core about being is strategic thinking. And I think there's not a lot of there's a lot of people in the world who have important decision-making authority and have no self-awareness whatsoever, it appears, about the cognitive biases that are going into their strategic decisions. I had a boss for a long time who used to say to people, including to me all the time, well, that wasn't strategic. What you did wasn't strategic. But what I learned that he meant over time was he just meant not being strategic meant I didn't do things the way, or whoever he was talking about didn't do things the way that he would have liked or preferred. So I think it does mean that, word strategy has been, it's maybe always been vague, but it certainly is, and probably bastardized in terms of just being an adjective that you apply to something, being strategic or not. In a lot of cases, I think when we say that somebody is strategic, it just really means that they're hyper conventional. That one of the things that I think people do in organizations, and one of the things I think sometimes organizations are trying to get people to do when they tell them to be strategic, is to just really learn the conventions of the organization as quickly as possible. And so if you can become hyper conventional, then you're going to follow, you're just following the formulas that everybody else follows, or at least the people with influence, the people with power in the organization follow. My own belief is that if you're hyper conventional, that means you're following those conventions all the time. If you're actually strategic, you're probably going to be following those conventions 80% of the time, and 20% of the time, because it is strategic to do so, you're actually going to be doing something different than what the dictate or what the conventions of the organization would dictate.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting challenge. So the fact that we're asking employees to be strategic, that we're including it on employee evaluations as a competency, but because it's ill-defined and vague, that in many cases it's actually counterproductive in the fact that we're emphasizing it. We're taking ourselves further away from that. And the simple act of, if you've been doing a job for a certain period of time and you just simply ask, is there a better way to do this task? You then chose to be strategic by asking that question.
Right.
I like that a lot. That's a very interesting way to frame it. So building on the strategic thinker, right? That's the choice and the behavior. We also have process, especially when an organization does have to face a change, whether it's a inflicted change or a selected change. They then still have to, craft strategy and make those decisions. How do you deal with a lot of executives. The world that they live in has lots of ambiguity. You have thousands of employees that you could get inputs from. You have customers and suppliers and competitors that you could analyze. How do you still distill down to the critical amount of information and inputs to help craft a strategy?
Yeah, I think there's two big things that are important on that front. One is creating what I like to call Zen information flow, which is an environment where fear and egos don't get in the way of you actually having access when you need it to the facts, to the data, to inform your trade-off decisions in support of your strategic goals. And so, because that's a problem in a lot of organizations, is that the bad news or the stuff that people need to hear, because they operate in an environment of fear, doesn't travel up and doesn't travel fast. And so one of the things that I really like, so one of the things that gives me a lot of hope about what's happening as organizations are increasingly adopting agile methodologies. Aside from the methodologies, what I like about the culture around agile is, some of the slogans like, fail fast, fail cheap, fail often. I think taking the fear out of getting things wrong is a big thing to increase Zen information flow. Some of the other things that I've heard in organizations, and of course that we preach into organizations and ask them to adopt, are mantras around reserving the right to get smarter, mantras around mistakes or intellectual capital. One of the things that I've heard and that I really like is mistakes are expected, inspected, and corrected. So again, if you create an environment where it's focused on learning and where it's focused on an expectation that mistakes will happen, then I think you can create the Zen information flow that makes it possible to have make more informed strategic choices. And all that having been said, we are very aware right now of how much of a VUCA environment we live in, with volatility and uncertainty and complexity and ambiguity, there is just no way to actually prepare for all the unknowns, and even if you have Zen information flow. And so I think a lot of it is also now, how do you create strategy that puts you in a spot to be resilient? You know, how do you create strategy that preserves options for you? And, you know, how do you I mean, this is a longer conversation, but, you know, how do you take into account you know, fat tail risk, where, you know, like we're seeing now with COVID-19, which is, you know, how do you create the resilience in your organization? How do you make yourself, like Nassim Taleb says, anti-fragile, so that when the things that are, when you have low probability but high impact events like we're having now with COVID-19, that it doesn't, you know, it doesn't blow you up because you have so fixated on a 5-year plan that was based on variables and on a reality that you know, it has dramatically changed.
Yeah. No, I think that cultural environment, right? So it's not just process, it's being open-minded, having a culture where learning occurs, where information can flow, where you have transparency, so that people get the information that they need. So we're running out of time, but there's a key question I really want to get to, because I think you are far more better positioned to answer this than others, based on your history and your teaching, your consulting. And that is really, how do you effectively communicate the strategy, right? So a leader at any level, as we've already talked about, might make a decision about where we want to go. Who needs to know that? How do they need to know it? What's the most effective way to really get that across to those that need to understand what direction you've chosen?
Yeah, it's something that I care a lot about, and I've just seen the power of what's possible when you actually meaningfully engage large numbers of people, when you rally and align them behind strategy. You know, I remember a long time ago, I was working with a new CIO, and he asked me to go with him to visit 700 employees in Portland. And he said, I want you to watch me do this town hall, because he's got, you know, all these other outposts. So before he goes and talks to everybody else, give me some feedback on how I'm communicating my strategy. And in this town hall, he said, hey, so I want to tell you about my strategy. What I was really brought here to do is to put in place this governance model, and it's called the Comprehensive Delivery Framework. And he went on to explain the Comprehensive Delivery Framework. And he said, okay, what are your questions? And, you know, this is 700 people, all of whom are wondering, we've got a new CIO, am I actually going to have a job here? And somebody raises their hand and said, hey, if I want to be supportive of this Comprehensive Delivery Framework, what do I, you know, like, how do I support this? And he said, well, you know, I'm going to be putting together some task forces. I think, you know, probably be smart for us to have about 7 people from Portland involved in that task force to help me figure this out. So, you know, 7 people are going, okay, well, you know, there's 700 of us here. Maybe 7 of us will have jobs when this is done. And so what I said to him afterward is, you know, you confuse the map for the territory, right? I mean, you know, this is what you're doing, but you need to have a representation of your strategy that actually invites people to help you. You know, Comprehensive Delivery Framework is part of your strategy, but we have to communicate a message to people that tells them where we're going and how they're going to get there in a way that's broad enough to explain everything that you're doing in the organization, including Comprehensive Delivery Framework. But it's also got to be actionable at every level of the organization, so that it provides a context for explaining everything that you're doing, but also any team at any level in the organization can say, okay, well, hey, well, if that's what the strategy is about, we can decide what we're doing in our team to help be aligned and advance the strategy. And so that's what we did. And that really is that, that's the formula anywhere is don't, you can talk about your strategy, but when it comes to having the message to represent and understand, a good map accentuates some things, and a good map doesn't try to be the territory that it represents. It can't, or it's not a good map. And it's really about telling a story in a way where people can understand where we're going, why, how we're going to get there. It doesn't sound like a consultant wrote it. It should sound very conversational, and it should explain everything that you're doing, provide context for all the big decisions that you're going to make, including the unpleasant ones potentially. And most importantly, it should give everybody an opportunity to go, okay, hey, well, if that's what we're doing, then I can figure out how I can contribute. I'm a big fan of that old, schmaltzy story about the traveler in, ancient times he comes across a stone cutter, and the stone cutter is like wailing away at the rocks, and he looks really peeved, and the traveler says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "What the hell does it look like I'm doing? I'm a stone cutter. I'm cutting stone. This work sucks. Leave me alone." So the traveler continues, and he sees a guy who's actually really happy and investing discretionary energy in the work that he's doing, and a big smile on his face. And he says to this stone cutter, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm building a cathedral." And that's really, I think, what communicating strategy is about, is giving people the context and the story so that they can legitimately put themselves in cathedral building mode.
Well, that's a great perspective, right? So if you go back to the traditional definitions of strategy, a lot of it is the coordinated actions that head towards a common goal. And so in that description, you've achieved that, but the extra embellishment on top of that is with how much energy, right? So
right.
you get a bunch of people taking daily actions that move them towards the direction chosen, but how much energy do they convert into that purpose? That communication becomes one of the effective mechanisms to help provide that energy as well as that connection. So, well, this was a great interview. I really appreciate your perspectives. I'm sure our listeners will as well. And thank you very much for participating.
Jamie, thanks for having me.